Hello, my name is Stacy Bowe. I am a Cultural Heritage Preservation Specialist with the Smithsonian's Cultural Rescue Initiative, known as SCRI. SCRI is a small team at the Smithsonian Institution with a mission to educate those who work with cultural heritage and about how disasters impact that cultural heritage. We train our colleagues on what you can do either to prevent or reduce a disaster's impact. This video is part of a series on the fundamentals of heritage conservation supported by the Getty Foundation. There are links to additional videos in this series available in English, Arabic, and Kurdish. My background is in archaeology and general museum preservation. In my current role, I focus on training others on how to plan for when a disaster happens. The goal of my video is to give you a brief introduction to disaster risk management, some of the key terms, and how to get started. The goal of disaster risk management is to prevent disasters from happening, or at least reduce their impact. So the first step in figuring out how to do this is to identify and quantify the risks that exist to your community and to the cultural heritage that you are in charge of protecting. But how do you figure out what a disaster's potential impact is? Well, that involves taking the time to figure out what risks exist in your context. So what is risk? Risk is actually a relationship between three different things, which we will further define in the next slides. As you can see on the screen, risk is when you take a hazard and multiply it by how exposed something is to that hazard, and then multiply it again by how vulnerable something is to that hazard. Since there are numerous hazards out there that can harm cultural heritage, calculating the risk for each one allows you to determine which ones are either most likely to happen or will be most severe, or it can even help you figure out which risks are not that harmful at all. Let's take the first piece of the calculation and discuss it more. What is a hazard? A hazard is anything that can cause damage to cultural heritage, and unfortunately, there are plenty of them. Think of these as the bigger versions of the agents of deterioration that were mentioned in the Introduction to Care of Museum Collections video. They could be a widespread fire or a flood. Hazards are not just caused by natural forces, they can be human too, such as theft or even neglected maintenance. But what makes hazards bad? Well, it's because at some point, cultural heritage will be exposed to them. Determining exposure means thinking about how common a certain hazard is in your environment and thinking about how it may come in contact with cultural heritage. Let's use a simple example. Let's think about the sun. Someone is only exposed to the sun when they go outside. And if someone goes outside and exposes their skin for a long period of time, what happens? You may end up with a sunburn. Now, let's use a cultural heritage example. Take a look at these ancient glass vases. If they were exposed to an earthquake, what would the result be? They would probably break. And why would they break? Well, that leads us to the final factor in our risk calculation formula, which is vulnerability. Vulnerability is the determination of how susceptible to damage something is. This requires an understanding of how materials react to certain hazards. For cultural heritage professionals, that means finding out what materials comprise your cultural heritage. Let's go back to our vases. Now, to assess vulnerability, you need to know how glass reacts to certain things. Remember how I asked you what would happen if they were exposed to an earthquake? As you know, glass is very vulnerable to sudden movement, and if they were to fall off of their shelves because of an earthquake, they would most likely break. But let's think about their vulnerability to a different kind of hazard. How about water? How vulnerable do you think they would be? Or how do you think they would react if they were exposed to water? I would like to assume, knowing what I know about glass, that the vases would not necessarily break from being exposed to water, but I would be worried about the paint or multicolored decorations that they have on their surface. It may dissolve or be negatively affected by the water. This assessment shows me that these vases have different levels of vulnerability to damage by an earthquake versus than they are from a flood. which would mean their overall risk between the two different hazards would be different. So now that we have gone through each part of the formula, how do you put them together? The next step is to label each of these factors using some sort of scale. What I would recommend for those of you who are new to calculating risk is the simple scale of low, medium, and high. That means for each factor in the formula, rate it according to low, medium, or high. For example, let's take high winds. Let's say that high winds are a fairly common phenomena in your region, so let's give it a medium rating. Now, a building could have high exposure to high winds because it is located out on the edge of a mountain. But its vulnerability could be rated as low because it is made of resilient or newer building material. So, multiplying medium by high and low ultimately gives you medium, which means that you have determined that high winds are a medium risk of damage to this building. Even if you are nervous or unsure on how to quantify each term, understanding these terms and communicating how they relate to each other is a great achievement for any steward of cultural heritage. Being able to identify a hazard, make a determination at how vulnerable cultural heritage is to that particular hazard, and assess how likely that heritage will be exposed to that hazard is a fundamental skill in disaster risk management. One other point I want to make about assessing risk is that you should also make sure you spend some time thinking about the cultural heritage that you are trying to protect. How is it used by the community? What aspects about the heritage make it so special? If it's a heritage building, think about how people access it or appreciate it. If the community were suddenly no longer able to access the building, what would that potentially do to this community? How about movable cultural heritage? Are there books or manuscripts that are considered examples of heritage? And is it because of their age or the information contained within them that make them so important? Do other copies of the books exist somewhere else? If they were damaged, could the information be recovered in other ways? These questions are meant to help you evaluate how hazards may affect not only the physical material of heritage, but its overall intangible value. The good news is that once you have calculated your risks and really assessed what's the most important aspect of your cultural heritage, you are able to use the findings to put together a plan. Obviously, the risks you've identified that are most severe should be prioritized, and you should invest time and resources to either prevent them from impacting cultural heritage or at least reducing their impact. You can also organize the plan according to what is feasible now and what you and your team need to work on in the long term. Your actions are fulfilling a different part of the disaster cycle, which is called mitigation or preparedness. By taking the time to identify risks, communicate those risks, and work through how you can either prepare for them, mitigate them, or potentially respond to them, you are executing your disaster risk management plan. Let's take this collection storage room, for example, and let's take a look at this figurehead right here. As it sits currently, let's think about a hazard that may affect this object. Let's think about theft. Well, it looks small enough that someone could easily pick it up, and based on the information in front of me, I don't know what the security is like to get into this room, so I'm going to rate that this object is not only highly vulnerable, but also highly exposed to theft. So as a disaster risk manager, how can I reduce its vulnerability, and how can I reduce its exposure? My recommendation would be to put this object into a protective box and make sure that the doors leading to this storage room are locked or barricaded. By conducting these actions, not only have I reduced its vulnerability to theft, I've also reduced the object's exposure to it as well, which means I have reduced its risk overall. This is a very simple example of how all of those factors in the risk calculation formula are related to each other and how taking steps to lowering each of them means you are lowering the overall risk of damage or harm to a piece of cultural heritage. I now want to show you how assessing risk allows you to make effective decisions when trying to manage risk. Let's take the Mara Museum, which is located in Syria. The museum houses amazing and very important mosaics. However, these mosaics are embedded into the museum walls and cannot be dismantled easily. Unfortunately, the staff were worried that the ongoing conflict in Syria was going to impact the museum, and they knew that they would not be able to move the mosaics to safety. Therefore, they decided to protect the mosaics in place by overlaying the surfaces with cloth and then piling sandbags in front of the mosaics. To review, that means that the staff identified a hazard that the mosaics would be exposed to, which is a potential explosion from the war. They then assessed how vulnerable the mosaics are to that type of hazard, which is high because of how fragile each tile within the mosaic is to strong forces. They realized that the risk of damage to the mosaics was extremely high, so they took the time and energy to implement a plan to reduce that potential damage. Their calculation and work paid off because the museum did suffer a bomb explosion later that year. However, when staff safely entered to assess the damage, they saw that their sandbags had worked. The force of the bomb traveled through the mosaics and was absorbed by the sandbags, which were then pushed away from the mosaic, but the mosaic itself remained intact. If you want to learn more about risks, not only how to identify them, but how to manage them, I recommend checking out the Guide to Risk Management, which is written by ECROM and the Canadian Conservation Institute, and it's been translated into many languages, including Arabic. I hope that this information has been helpful and wish you well on your future projects in identifying and calculating risks to the cultural heritage that you protect.